Welcome back to BadgerBlitz TV, your Rivals.com destination for all things Wisconsin athletics. I'm Matt Perkins, joined by John McNamara, publisher of BadgerBlitz.com. John, it's been a pretty busy week.
To say the least, very, very busy in June.
Yeah, it was, I think as is sort of the new norm now with Coach Fickell's recruiting staff, June is the busiest time of year. Since we last talked, John, 5 commitments over the past, 8 days. We're going to go in reverse chronological order, break them down just a little bit, starting with Eugene Hilton, the 4-star receiver, T.Y. Hilton's son, who is I think a pretty big piece for this receiver class moving forward. I think it says a lot about how the Badgers can now start really competing for higher end talent at the receiver position, with it being the 3rd straight year they will have brought in a 4-star receiver.
Absolutely. And, you talk about a position that Wisconsin struggled to recruit real high end talent. I think there's been only 4 kids in the Rivals 250 since 2002 that have signed with Wisconsin at that receiver position. So, Eugene Hilton is right up there in the same kind of ilk as those guys in the past. So, in Hilton Jr., you're getting probably Wisconsin's top target at that receiver position since the fall, I would say. And I think a big reason why Wisconsin was able to land him was the effort that they put in and the consistent push that they've made since the fall. So, they got him up on campus for a game of the fall, and then another time when it was in the winter for junior day, I believe, and then obviously for the official visit. So really from start to finish, Wisconsin's been there, and I think that's a big reason why they went out in his recruitment. I think something to note too is, the coaching transition from Mike Brown to Kenny Guyton and Pat Lambert kind of bridging that gap and holding everything together for Wisconsin, I think was real critical. When I talked to Hilton Jr., he talked about the relationship he has with Guyton, but, like I said, it really started with, that original coaching staff and Mike Brown. So, kudos to Pat Lambert and that recruiting staff for, kind of gluing that recruitment together during that transition phase and eventually landing Hilton Jr.
And that was obviously a big one. And maybe as big a signing is Mason Posa, the 4-star linebacker out of Albuquerque, whose last 2 weeks of his recruitment were about as topsy-turvy as I can remember. John, we've been along for the ride for this one for a little bit. This has been an interesting story to say the least. But Posa lands at Wisconsin, which I think further solidifies the linebacking core as the number 1 unit on the team.
Yeah, just the continuation of revamping that inside linebacker position at Wisconsin. You're adding Posa to a group that is super talented. Obviously, I think Jaheim Thomas and Jake Chaney will likely be your starters this year, but Taka Curtis, Christian Allegro will play a ton as well. Sebastian Cheeks is there. The staff likes Tyler Janzi, Landon Gauthier. You just kind of go down the list, and now you're adding Posa and Cooper Catalano to that group. So, it's went from a position of weakness in 2023 to, I think, a position of strength in 2024 and beyond. You talk about Hilton Jr. being atop Wisconsin's board at receiver. Posa is very much atop Wisconsin's linebacker board. You could make an argument going back to the fall. Wisconsin, I think, was his second Power 5 offer. They stayed on him consistently ever since. He saw his recruitment explode with Oregon, USC, Alabama, Texas A&M, a ton of those, top tier offers, I guess you could say, but Wisconsin and Mike Tressel and Heinecker and, Luke Fickell too played a big role in this one, because I know how much Luke Fickell liked him and the wrestling background and the connection that he had with his dad through his wrestling background. I think it all kind of, made sense in the end for Wisconsin. And, I can assure you that he was atop their board and, probably one of the best fits in the eyes of the Wisconsin coaching staff of guys that they've got in this 2025 class. Brings a ton of versatility. I think they'll start him on the inside, but, Post is a guy like I think you'll see with Jaheim Thomas this year. He can play inside on those obvious, I shouldn't say obvious, but, traditional running downs. And then, 3rd and long, you can bump him to the outside and have him just say, hey, go get the quarterback. I think that's something that Wisconsin loves about him as well.
Which of these two is a more meaningful signing in your eyes for the sort of the program at large, Posa or Hilton?
I would say Hilton Jr., even though, those 2 great prospects that you're adding to this class, but just in terms of the ability to recruit a specific position. Receiver traditionally has been more difficult. Wisconsin has recruited linebackers well, and I think developed extremely well, the bigger piece of that. So getting a guy like Hilton Jr., the versatility that he provides, the talent that he provides to the position is significant. So I would say, of the two, which is more important to the program, I'd go Hilton Jr., but like that staff loves both of those guys that they were able to get.
So before that, we had three other notable signings. Torin Pettaway, who flipped from Minnesota back to Wisconsin, was last Tuesday. On Monday, we had Nizyi Davis, the tight end out of Indianapolis. And Sunday, adding to that very deep defensive back room, Jahmare Washington out of Chicago, who the Badgers offered a long time ago. Seemed cool for a little while, then it heated back up at the end. He's a guy who's got a really unique athletic background. But John, out of these three, who do you think will see the field first?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. I think you look at Pettaway and Washington. I think they're both still kind of raw prospects, right? And I think that, you look at the defensive line and you're like, well, they're looking for guys to step up there. Pettaway's got 1 year of football under his belt. So I think that you're going to see a big jump for his senior year. But again, he's raw. I think that, he's a guy that obviously his best football is still very much out in front of him. You look at a guy like Washington, 6'2", kind of 170, 180 pounds or so. Wisconsin loves that size there, but as you've seen, they've collected a good amount of talent at that cornerback position now. So I think it'd be difficult for any of these kids that they have in this 2025 class to say, hey, they're going to come in and play as a true freshman, only because of, the talent that they've brought in at cornerback and, what they expect to bring back. Davis is an interesting one. He's coming off an injury. But Wisconsin feels like they got one of the better tight ends in the country. And I guess I'm a little surprised that his recruitment didn't leak out, outside of the Midwest. I think he's someone to keep an eye on this fall as a kid who could put together some pretty legit tape and have a handful of other schools who may still be, looking for a tight end, kind of reach out, sniff around, kick the tires, maybe extend an offer. I think he's lined up to have a monster senior season. The tools are there, the size is there. Again, coming off an injury, which maybe kind of derailed his recruitment just slightly, but he's a guy that, hey, you talk about who could bump up from 3 stars to 4 stars. I think as Davis is, near or at the top of that list for Wisconsin.
Yeah, he coming in after he seems almost like a hybrid of the two tight ends that they got in the 2024 class in a lot of ways. He's not as big and physical as Steck. He's not as sort of pure a pass catcher maybe as Woods, but he can absolutely he's more of a do-it-all kind of guy. And I could definitely see him, like you said, John, if he does have those big numbers, playing against some good competition in the state of Indiana, like Eugene Hilton, where Pat Lambert seems to be doing some really good work out there. As we'll see how much the Badgers continue to target the Hoosier State for recruiting going forward. This past weekend, the Badgers hosted just a small bevy of prospects, mostly 20, some sort of a couple committed guys. Landon Locke, Luke Emmerich were in town, but it was defensive line weekend with also Eric Schmidt, the kicker out of Milwaukee. Let's talk defensive line recruiting though first, John. Drayden Pavey from Cincinnati and Kyler Garcia from my hometown, Nashville, Tennessee, were up. We know that Pettaway isn't enough on the defensive line. How did it go with these two interior prospects this weekend, John? Where do you think EJ Whitlow and the staff are sort of going at the moment?
Yeah, it's kind of a juggling act right now because you got a few plates kind of spinning in the air, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how the dominoes fall here. Defensive line as a whole, like you talked about, Matt, they have Torin Pettaway. Cade Petrak is a take no matter what. So, no matter how those dominoes fall of guys who are recently on campus, they will find room from him from now until signing day if he chooses to. So he's got Wisconsin, Oklahoma. I think he's just coming off a Nebraska official. Very quiet, so it's tough to get a read on him. And then you have Wilders and Telemark, who will announce Tuesday. And that's a significant piece for Wisconsin because I don't, unless P-Track is part of this mix, it doesn't get to 4. But it could get to 3 depending on, the fit outside of Telemark, who we have future casts in to land at Wisconsin. So again, you talk about recruiting, you talk about dominoes that are falling. So, once something falls, then other pieces kind of tend to fall in place beyond him. So, I think that if Telemark does end up at Wisconsin, that Wisconsin then would go and try to get either one of Pavey or Garcia. And Pavey's recruitment has been kind of interesting. I felt really good about Wisconsin coming into that visit. I feel a little bit differently this morning. I think he plans to decide on his birthday, which off the top of my head, I think is July 8th. So, right now I have a future cast in for Purdue. So we'll see. Wisconsin's going to keep fighting there, but I think that, once Telemark is in and they can catch their breath a little bit, they always kind of reevaluate their board. They go over things again, and spots are at a premium right now. You're looking at 19, could get to 20 by Tuesday. And then look, there's maybe 2 spots, 3 spots, maybe 4. I think this class could get to 25 because it's a huge senior class that Wisconsin has right now. So numbers aren't necessarily a problem. But there's a lot of guys that Wisconsin really likes and just a handful of spots left. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this class closes for Wisconsin because there's some no doubt guys. There's P-Track that we talked about, Trey Poteet. They're not going to turn away Jaden Woods. So it's going to be really interesting to see how these dominoes fall. And this class could be 95% complete by by the time we get to Big Ten Media Days. I'd feel pretty good about saying that.
So speaking of scholarships numbers, taking specialists is always a tricky game on scholarship numbers. And I, for one, am very for, especially if you have a truly elite kicker, punter, I am all for full scholarship for that individual. That's Eric Schmidt, who is the number 1 punter in the nation, the number 8 kicker in the nation by Cole's Kicking, I think. And he's a Wisconsin native from Milwaukee and is clearly an elite prospect at that position. Special teams have been a pretty consistent negative for the Badgers for half a decade. The last notable kicker was Rafael Gaglianone. The last good punter was Kevin Stemke. I mean, it's been a minute since the Badgers had, an effective punt game. And look what Torrey Taylor did for Iowa last year. Iowa won the division basically on the back of a punter. And as Wisconsin has to go against better and better competition, you need every margin that you can get. And it can be a huge one if you have really effective special teams. I think Eric Schmidt, if he really is that guy, like Cole says he is, and Cole's has sort of been the standard for a long time when it comes to kicking and punting evaluations and long snapping evaluations. If he's that guy, like, he's worthy of a scholarship, and I think you have to push to get him. I know that Michigan is kind of considered the leader, but Notre Dame is in there, and there's a reason for that. He's really, really good. Give him a scholarship as far as I'm concerned. So that's sort of where I'm at with it, John. What do you think about Schmidt and sort of the path of his recruitment?
I think history would tell you that Luke Fickell agrees with what you're saying, because if you look at the roster right now, they have a scholarship kicker, they have a scholarship punter, and they have a scholarship long snapper. So, like, the importance of special teams is not lost on Luke Fickell. As it pertains to Schmidt, when I got a chance to talk to him, he said that it's a preferred walk-on offer now, but once second semester hits, I go on scholarship, or I would go on scholarship. That's
what we call, like, that's like old school gray shirt, basically.
Right. So, in like grand scheme of things, that sounds pretty good, but he's got a full ride to Boston College. He's at Notre Dame tomorrow, which is Tuesday, and they're kind of in this, I would imagine they're in a very similar position to Wisconsin, of like, how much can we give this kid before we have to offer a full ride? And I think Michigan's kind of in that same boat as well. So, when I talked to him, he said, scholarship's not going to be everything, but it is going to be important. Now, you could also bridge that gap with NIL money, right? I mean, you've seen Wisconsin do that in football before with walk-ons that they really like, that you've seen them do it in basketball. So I think there are ways to make this work. But I think it largely depends on what other schools are offering and, the kind of plan that they have for him. What I think is most intriguing about Schmidt is that, and again, I'm like you said, Matt, I'm relying on Coles because I don't evaluate kickers or punters. I'm just strictly going off what their ranking says and nothing beyond that. He can come in and kick, or he can come in and punt, and he can come in and handle field kickoffs too, which has been an issue for Wisconsin, of consistently putting the ball in the end zone and not worrying about that part of the special teams game. So his ability to do all three of those things, to me, makes him one of the more unique specialists that I've covered since I've been doing this. And Wisconsin's got a kicker in Vakos. They have a punter who was shaky last year in Atticus Bertram. So I just think with all those things kind of moving around, all those parts, that Schmidt makes a lot of sense. Would they give him a full ride to get him into this class? That's a good question. I think it doesn't have as much to do with him as it does with like the 10 guys I could tell you off the top of my head that are like plan A guys who are still on Wisconsin's board. So again, he's part of that equation of, it's going to be really interesting to see how this thing kind of filters out.
Plan A guys, two come to mind for me, which is Byron Lewis, the tailback out of Florida, and Hardy Watts, the offensive lineman out of Massachusetts. If the Badgers do land Telemock, who's from South Florida, from Opelika, and are able to get Lewis as well, which the plan at running back is Lewis or bust. That's pretty widely known. And, I think if they get those two Florida guys, that would be, a really nice step for this recruiting staff to continue to build more inroads in South Florida. That, when we've seen the Badgers be most successful, they've had a lot of guys from South Florida be on the team. So I think increasing those numbers is huge. But Watts, I'm an offensive line guy, and Watts is a nasty player in the best kind of ways. John, those three guys to me are some of the big things left for 2025. What else do you think that the Badgers need to round out this class?
Yeah, just to go over that real quick, like you were talking about, Matt, you're correct in that it's kind of Lewis or bust at running back. Now, there are no definitives in recruiting. Things can always change, but that's the plan as of right now. You took three in the 2024 class, three guys that they're super high on. So you feel good about just kind of going for it all in 2025. And if you don't get there, then you allocate that scholarship to another position. You mentioned the remaining guys. I think they'd like Brock Lennon at tight end, an offer from Ohio State. That's going to be a tough one for Wisconsin to overcome. A kid from Ohio who was essentially, I think he winds up at Wisconsin had Ohio State not offered. Receiver, you have Tunkara that's still out there. That's one of those of like, the staff's going to have to sit down and meet and decide, and can we take a kid like this if he still wants to come? With four linemen committed, it's kind of like Watts or probably no one else. You'd love to have a kid like that. I think he's, if you look at that 2024 class and what they have in 2025, if they were to get him, I would put him only behind Kevin Haywood in terms of talent and, next level ability. From those two classes together, I think he's that good. You watch the tape and there's tons to like, and I know that Wisconsin thinks very, very highly of him. Probably one more outside linebacker. You're looking at Jaden Woods or Nicholas Clayton. The staff would take either of those. I think they want one more piece there. Cornerback, Zay Gentry's still out there, and they're working to get him out of Texas. Probably working more so on his mom to allow her son to leave the state of Texas, which is, if you follow recruiting, you got to get the mom on board. That's usually the number one thing. So obviously he's committed to SMU. We kind of have him as a soft verbal because he took that official to Wisconsin. I think he'll end up at one of those two schools, but he's really trying to figure out, can I leave the state of Texas and feel good and have my family feel good about that. So that's a big decision that he's kind of pondering there. So, like I said, there's 9 or 10 guys that are still floating out there that are still options for Wisconsin, and Petrak and Petit, like we talked about, they're all in that mix too. So it's, there's not enough scholarships to make all those guys have a room in this class. So again, it's going to be an interesting finish.
Well, as the class does wrap up, we can start looking towards 2026. Coaches could finally get sort of like, the official offers out there and contact out there with 2026s. And there are a handful of notable ones on campus this past weekend. So let's start outside of quarterback, because quarterback's always the most important position. We'll talk about that in a minute. But who do you think is the most either important player or position group for the class of 2026?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you brought it up, and they've done a nice job of addressing the depth issues that they have. I think that you went into this class, or even you go last year and said, okay, tight end's thin, but then they signed 2 and 24, they get Jackson McGowan, and then they get Nizyi Davis out of Indianapolis. So that position looks like it's pretty well stocked. Quarterback is always a position people want to talk about. I think they'll likely take 1 in this class, even though I think they should take 2, but that's probably a different show, different topic. But if they go without a running back, then I would say that, running back then again becomes a pretty big position of need. You guys have guys like Sean Alston, a kid from Ohio, I believe, who is scheduled to come back on campus July 27th. I think that's their next big event. So, just way too early type thing, running back, I think could be it. With the guys that AJ Blazek brought on campus this weekend, I think he brought 5 or 6 offensive linemen. So he's making that seem like it's a huge position of emphasis as well. I think that speaks more to his enthusiasm and success and ability to recruit than it does to Wisconsin's necessarily need, because they went 5 in 2024. They could go 5 in 2025. So that number likely won't be as high in 2026. So recruiting never stops. So just as they're welcoming the 2025 kids with one hand, they welcome 2026 kids with the other hand in the same weekend. So it's just kind of wild.
Yeah, you mentioned
busy times.
Yeah, those offensive linemen, Evan Goodwin from Little Rock. You got Tyler Merrill from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, who I know has at least somewhat of a connection to Kevin Haywood. Kevin Haywood, putting in the work as a host or, as a point of contact, at least already after his first semester here on campus. The name, though, that stood out to me, these 2026s, and the position group that I think is always going to be sort of at the top of everyone's mind is going to be defensive line, and will continue to be defensive line. And King Liggins out of Chicago, Brother Rice, I think it is. Right, John? Is that, or is he Mount Carmel? I can't remember.
No, Brother Rice is correct.
Yeah. So defensive line, he's an interesting player. John, thoughts on Liggins as a defensive line target moving forward? Did that surprise you that he came out of camp with an offer?
Not really when you put the tape on. There's no better offer, in my opinion, than a camp offer, right? To spend 2 hours with a kid, putting them through the drills that you're comfortable with, doing the things that you want to see in the scheme that, all those things. There's no better way to evaluate a kid than to get them up at your camp and, run them through all your stuff. And then, they bring these kids backstage too, and they weigh them, they measure them. They like to see how flexible they are. I don't know, like if Clint Cosgrove is back there, you might look at their ankles, all sorts of stuff that they like to do with them. So I think any kid for any school, if he picks up an offer from camp, like you feel pretty good about it because the staff at whatever school was able to spend a good chunk of time with him. And, he had really good things to say about Wisconsin. Obviously, Brother Rice is a place Wisconsin's recruited. They were in on a kid. His name is escaping me now. Big defensive lineman, Roderick Pierce, committed that ended up at Michigan. So, they've recruited that high school. He talked about, his relationship with EJ Whitlow and get to spend the day with him essentially during the camp and then on the visit. And, he's talked about that's a guy I could see myself playing for, talked about the academics at Wisconsin. So that seems like a good fit pretty early in the process here. He's another kid I think they're going to try to get up for that just July 27th date, which I think is their second big 2026 and beyond event that they had. The first one was this past weekend. So, they're just continuing to identify, continuing to offer, and continuing to try to get talented kids on campus.
Yeah, it is, like you said, recruiting never stops, John. And it is, through the summer goes on, it'll be a little bit of a dead period, but there's going to be picking up with these 2026s and rounding out the 2025s. To stay up to date on all the latest recruiting news, make sure you subscribe to BadgerBlitz.com, part of the Rivals Network. You get all the latest insights on the message boards. Special shout out to Briscoe for being the king of Twitter. If someone visited camp this weekend, Briscoe knows about it and he will tell you about it on the boards. So thank you for everyone here for tuning in to Badger Blitz TV. Please subscribe, etc. And until next time, we'll see you in the den.